pretty much the same as several previous books he's written on the topic. The conclusions and the political framework has been radically changed. Now, it's no problem for people to change their opinions on the basis of new evidence, but what happens in Morris's new book, 1948, is he radically changes his opinions by subtracting evidence. So let's take just briefly, because we're a radio program, some examples. In his previous book, he says, transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism, and this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs. And he goes on to say in another book that it was the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement that was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. So we have two basic facts. Number one, Zionism, inbuilt into it, was the expulsion of the indigenous population. And number two, the Palestinians or Arabs opposed Zionism because they were fearful of losing their homes and losing their country. But now when you open up his new book, cause and effect have been reversed. It becomes now the Palestinians who are the expulsionists, to use his words, and it's the Zionist movement which is reacting to the Palestinians, which causes them to be occasionally expulsionists. It's as if to say the Native American population of the United States was expulsionist because it refused to acquiesce in the European settlers taking over their homes.
Professor Morris.
I think Finkelstein has a blinkered view and he sees only certain documents. What I try to do is look at actually the breadth of the documentation and derive conclusions about the past. The Palestinian national movement led by Haj Amin al-Husseini in the 1920s, 30s and 40s wanted to expel the Jews. The Jews felt they had a moral right to live in the country and to re-establish their sovereignty in the country, at least in part of it. The Palestinians thought not. They didn't care about Jewish history. They cared nothing about Jewish tragedy or persecution over the 2,000 years and wanted to expel them from the country. They didn't get the chance because they lost the war. So something like the reverse had happened. But the fact is, and this is something most Arab commentators ignore or don't tell us, the Palestinians rejected the UN partition resolution. The Jews accepted it. They accepted the possibility of dividing the country into two states with one Arab state and a Jewish state. And the Jewish state, which was to come into being in 1947-48, according to the United Nations, was to have had an Arab population of 400,000 to 500,000 and a Jewish population of slightly more than 500,000. That was what was supposed to come into being, and that is what the Zionist movement accepted. When the Arabs rejected it and went to war against the Jewish community, it left the Jewish community no choice. It could either lose the war and be pushed into the sea, or ultimately push out the Arab minority in their midst who wanted to kill them. It's an act of self-defense, and that's what happened. My facts in all my books have not changed at all. They're all there. But one has to look at also the context in which things happened, and this was the context: an expulsionist mentality, an expulsionist onslaught on the Jewish community in Palestine by Palestine's Arabs and by the invading Arab armies, and a Jewish self-defense which involved also pushing out large numbers of Palestinians.
Saree Makdisi, this issue of the acceptance of the partition, can you take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, there are several things about it. For one thing, as Dr. Morris points out, it's true that the mainstream Zionist movement accepted the partition plan, but on the other hand, as his own historical record shows, Ben-Gurion and others were very frank that the acceptance was meant to be tactical rather than sort of, you know, wholehearted. So the idea was to accept and then go from there, not just to accept and then really settle down into the two states as envisaged by the UN partition plan. Meanwhile, the Arab rejection of the plan had to do with the fact that basically the Palestinians and Arabs were being told that they should become a minority in their own land. That's what this is fundamentally all about as well. So the question is, which viewers have to contemplate, is what would they do if somebody came and told them that they should either become a minority in their own homeland, that is second-class citizens, or be removed from their homeland? And I think almost anybody would say this is an unreasonable proposition. So again, it comes back to the question of what would you do in this situation? But more than that, I think what's important to ask Dr. Morris, as long as we have him with us, is when you talk about, Dr. Morris, when you talk about the events of 1948, in that famous interview with Haaretz in 2004, you say quite clearly that ethnic cleansing is justified, and that the main problem, as far as you see it then anyway, was that Ben-Gurion didn't go far enough in completing the ethnic cleansing, that he should have removed as much as possible of the non-Jewish population all the way to the Jordan River. So my question to you is this still a position that you hold? Do you still think it was justified? Do you still think that Ben-Gurion should have finished the job? And do you think still that in some ways that is the origin of the conflict as it persists to this day?
My point in the Haaretz interview, and I repeat it since then, is that a Jewish state could not have arisen with a vast Arab minority, 40, almost 50% of its population being Arabs, which opposed the existence of that Jewish state and opposed there being a large minority in that state. And they went and they showed that by going to war against the Jewish state, which left the Jews in an intolerable position. Either they give in and don't get a state, or they fight back, and in fighting back end up pushing out Arabs. My point also was that and this is really the point, and I think you would agree with it and understand it perhaps on the logical plane, if not on the emotional plane, had the war ended, the 1940 war ended, with all the Palestinian population being moving, it doesn't matter how, across the Jordan River, and there establishing their state in Jordan, across the river, a Palestinian Arab state, and had the Jews had their state without a large Arab minority on the west bank of the Jordan River, between the river and the Mediterranean Sea, the history of the Middle East, the history of Israel-Palestine, the history of the Palestinians and of the Jews would have been much better over the past 60 years. Since 48, all we've had is terrorism, clashes, wars, and so on, all of which have caused vast suffering to both peoples. And had this separation of populations occurred in 1948, I'm sure the Middle East would have enjoyed, and both peoples would have enjoyed, a much better future since 1948.
We're going to go to break, then we're going to come back to this discussion. Our guests are Benny Morris, a professor, historian at Ben-Gurion University in Tel Aviv. We're also joined from UCLA by Saree Makdisi, who is the author of the book Palestine Inside Out. On the phone with us from Brussels is Norman Finkelstein. Among his books, The Holocaust Industry and Beyond Chutzpah. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Marcel Khalifa here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue with this discussion, I wanted to turn, though, to an excerpt of an interview I did with former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. This is President Carter talking about his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and why he describes the situation in Palestine as one of apartheid.
Well, the message is very clear. It deals with Palestine. not inside Israel itself, just the Palestinian occupied territories. And the word apartheid is exactly accurate. This is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except their Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way.
Professor Morris, your response.
I think the image of apartheid is problematic, and